Oh, wow. Might have to trim the beginning of this. Okay, everybody. So we are gathered here today to talk about matrix spec change proposals. And what I have is a couple of slides that try to explain how matrix spec changes work. But before I start screen sharing and going through that in detail, I guess it's probably worth just reminding everybody what matrix spec changes are, because one of the fundamental things we've tried to do with matrix that our predecessors failed to do is to basically have one monolithic spec. And anybody who's tried to implement other protocols over the years might have hit the frustration that they have no idea what the correct flavor of spec to use is. So it could be on IRC where you've got an RFC, but in practice there are all sorts of weird and wonderful extensions and unspecified things like different channel modes, different user modes, just different slash commands that different implementations have had. And it's been a fragmented mess. You've also, and often you might even find that the same user modes and channel modes might be used for completely different purposes on different IRCDs and servers. And or it might be in a XMPP land where you have the ZEP system for the extensions to the protocol, but they end up all over the place with lots of people proposing different ways of solving problems, and often having multiple ways of solving the same problem, and it's somewhat unclear as to which is the correct one to use at any given time and what the sort of correct interoperability profile is. And in the defense of XMPP, they have gone and published these ZEPs that say, hey, in 2021, you should be using this mix of spec things together. But wouldn't it be nice if you just didn't have to do that at all? Wouldn't it be nice if there was just one version of the spec at any given point with a given version number, and people could say, I speak matrix 1.1, and you know that your 1.1 matrix client will be able to talk to other 1.1 matrix clients and servers, and it will all magically work. And so that's what we tried to do with the spec. And obviously, though, you still need a way to evolve the thing. And as people have pointed out over the years, particularly Moxie at Signal, there is a risk that a standards-based approach can't evolve as rapidly as a proprietary centralized approach like WhatsApp or some other system where you control the entire thing. And his approach to that is to say that decentralization is bad and it slows everything down and you should centralize everything and do it Signal style. Obviously, we have the opposite approach and instead feel that we should instead design a spec process that allows us to experiment, go fast, break things, go wild, going and coming up with new features, and yet also provide a way that once you're happy that your crazy idea is the right way to do it, that it's something that everybody else can build on top of and use and incorporate, and it will be part of the one true way of doing things. Somebody, if you're not muted, can you mute? I'm getting all sorts of interesting breathing and drinking and other noises. Thank you. So, with all that in mind, that's what matrix spec changes are trying to do. They're meant to be deltas against the spec, where people propose how you go and add something into matrix, and anybody can do it. It's meant to be as lightweight and easy and genuinely fun and empowering as possible, rather than it being a bureaucratic or annoying or heavyweight or sort of tedious, pedantic thing. So let me try to persuade Jitsi to share my screen, and I will try to take you through my attempt to demystify the MSC process. Of course, Chrome. Oh, Jitsi is not actually showing the one thing that I need to share. I'll just give up and share my whole screen, like so. Can you see a demystifying MSCs slide?
Yep.
Amazing. Let me unmute my video at the same time so you can see me. At least I would if I press that button there. There we go. So, as I said, MSCs are meant to be how matrix evolves. And I've tried to put the entire process on one slide just to spell out that it's simple enough that it can fit on one slide. I'll go through it quickly now, and then I'll go through it kind of section by section. Then we'll go through it again in graphical form, and then we'll do a worked example, and then nobody will ever want to hear about MSCs ever again. So as I said, the whole point is that they're meant to be quick and fun and easy. So the too long didn't read is that, first of all, if you want to change Matrix to do something that it doesn't do today, you just write a free-form proposal. And honestly, it doesn't even have to follow a template, although Hubert wisely points out that if you haven't done it before, you should just go and crib off the template to have inspiration for what this should look like. It might also make sense to sketch it out completely informally without a template beforehand. And if it's a complicated thing, you might want to do a kind of design document beforehand and then sort of formalize it a little bit into the markdown form of an MSC. But in practice, it's intended to really take whatever shape you feel most comfortable saying, I think that we should add foo to Matrix because it solves this problem, and the way it solves this problem is to do this. And it has these security problems, and or it has these security properties, and it has these other properties, and it relates to these other MSCs. That's basically what the template gives you. Really important to ask for feedback, nice and early, from other people. Ideally, the spec core team, which is the 8 people I think we have at the moment, who are responsible for kind of signing off on what actually then gets applied to the spec, to check that it's something that is wanted. And you could ping us via GitHub, or we've created this new Matrix room called Hash, SET Office, the office of the spec core team on matrix.org, to ask for attention. So, for instance, if you think that Matrix should have native support for MRI formats for people wanting to exchange 3D volumetric data from their magnetic resonance imaging machines, you might go and fire up your sort of local text editor, write some markdown saying, I think that MRI is super important and a fundamental thing that Matrix should support. And then you might put it in a GitHub gist, or you might put it on a HackMD or a Hedgehog style collaborative editor. You could put it underneath Etherpad or Google Docs, whatever floats your boat, and chuck the URL into SCT Office or matrix.org, or possibly hash matrix-spec on matrix.org to ask the wider spec community and say, hey, everybody, do you think that MRIs are a good idea? And somebody from the spec core team is likely to pop up and say, wow, this is very domain specific, and it looks like a really interesting MSC. But honestly, this is probably something that's handled as a separate layer above Matrix in some kind of generic file format thing, or possibly, I don't know, if it's real-time streaming of MRI data, perhaps that should be part of the VoIP spec using the WebRTC signaling negotiation or whatever. And before you spend years of your life polishing this amazing proposal for how MRI imagery should work in Matrix, you might get some feedback that this isn't a good idea. Or alternatively, it could be, I know, why don't we have the ability to specify retention period for media on media repositories? At which point people would say, interesting, we already have a couple of MSCs trying to solve this. Why don't you work on top of those? Or alternatively, it could be, wow, that's a great idea. Nobody's done that before. That'd be an awesome thing to have in Matrix. It's something that everybody else has, and we need it in Matrix. So if you want to do a spec proposal for it, that would be great. I actually had one of those last night where a guy pinged to say, hey, why don't you turn on Hidden Service Federation with Tor Hidden Services on matrix.org? And I said, well, we can't really do that because we don't yet have an MSC that defines how you would specify whether a room is available on Tor or not. Otherwise, all the servers in the room need to be on Tor for it to work at the moment. So therefore, you need to have an MSC of that. And he said, okay, fair enough, I'll go and write one. So in that instance, he just DM'd me directly as a member of the spec core team, but he equally well could have come into hash SCT Office or Matrix spec to ask for attention. By the way, folks, please interrupt with questions as I go, particularly if I'm not making any sense. The next step is that you PR your proposal into the proposal subdirectory of Matrix doc repository on the matrix.org organization on github.com. And this is just a folder with a whole bunch of markdown Matrix spec change documents in it. You name the document after the PR number that GitHub allocates you when you PR it in from your branch. Your branch can be on whatever repository you feel that you want to PR in from. And then if you are still iterating on this and you don't think it's ready for review by the spec core team yet, you mark it as a WIP, or you make it a draft, mark it as a draft PR on GitHub. Now, the really interesting thing that we do that other folks don't typically require is that we have to, we require that people have proven that their crazy MSC actually works in the world first. And this was a bit of a reaction against XMPP, where we saw that a lot of ZEPs over the years were written by people with a crazy idea, and there was never an implementation, or there was a proprietary implementation, even worse, and there was no evidence that this thing would actually really work on the public network. So we explicitly say that you need to have, a branch of app, whether it's a client or a server, depending on what the feature is, that shows this thing actually working, and that you've used it with some real users and shown that it's not just vaporware sci-fi, but actually have kind of shaken out the implementation details, and this thing is now to a point where it can be formalized into the spec. And once you've done that and you're happy with it and you want to get it actually into the spec, you then ask for final review. And that could be a comment on the PR, it could be pinging us in #SET office, or otherwise somehow get the attention of the spec core team to say, oi, I'd really like this to be actually put into Matrix. Then we review it on the spec core team, and it does this slightly unexpected dance where rather than just merging it directly into the spec, instead we give the community a 5-day grace period called an FCP, a final comment period, where we basically signal the intention to everybody that, hey, we're happy with this as a spec core team. Is the rest of the community happy with it too? And everybody, you've got 5 days to raise any final concerns. And if nobody raises concerns, at the end of that, the PR gets merged into the repository. If people do raise concerns, then you go back to square one, or one of the previous squares, in order to let people basically have their concern resolved, either by dismissing it or reviewing it some more. It's basically a sort of emergency safety net final review stage. Having got the MSC itself, so this markdown document, merged into the repository, the final bit you have to do is obviously to put it into the spec itself. And that's typically done by the spec core team, which empirically tends to be Travis, who has, I think, the most expertise at this point in writing the PRs against the spec raw material itself. And it's literally basically formalizing the relatively informal language of the MSC and putting it into the YAML and the Swagger, or the Open API, I should call it, or whatever other sort of raw material that goes into the spec these days. That then gets a quick review and is merged, and next time we cut a release of the spec, which happens roughly every quarter, I think, in theory, then that is then officially 100% part of Matrix. So that is the overview. Any questions at this point? Are you still there? Oh, I'm just going to want somebody to unmute so I have kind of comfort noise to make sure that I'm not talking into the void.
We're still around.
Yay! Brilliant.
No questions so far.
I'm disappointed, Bruno. Okay, so crashing swiftly on. Let's go for it sort of step by step. So you want to write an MSC. First of all, you probably want to figure out what you want to do, what the changes that you want to make in Matrix. Obvious no-brainer, check to see if somebody is already working on it. And you look at the proposals index page, which is this beautiful set of tables we have nowadays, showing all of the proposals in their various stages of life. And some of them are in progress, some of them are in final call for proposal, some of them are merged into the spec, some of them are obsolete and abandoned and closed as you go down the page. And we've tried to name them sensibly, so if you search for a given keyword, like media or MRI, you will get all of the MSCs popping up to do with that. Then sketch out the API changes needed. If it's a big complicated change, do it as a design document first, and then try to split MSCs out from that. I at least really like HackMD or Hedgehog as being a really, really lightweight collaborative Markdown editor that lets people comment on the Markdown as it's being rapidly sort of put together to try to describe what's going on. And as I said earlier, you should do it based on the template. The template is called, I think, 0000 template in the proposals directory in the repository, and it's got about 5 or 6 sections with some kind of sample content, or at least some explanation of the content that you should put in there. But it's really not that exciting, to say the least. In fact, perhaps if I just flip to my Sublime, and you can see here I am going and working on the Groups as Rooms MSc in MSc 1772, and here is 0000 proposal template. And the sort of things you have here is, in the first section, actually tell us what problem you're trying to solve. Lots of people surprisingly don't actually say what problem they're trying to solve, but just say, hey, I think we should paint the bike shed blue. And there isn't any justification as to why blue is clearly the best color in the world. Then the actual proposal of, and this is how we're going to solve it. Then potential issues, which is really important, honestly, to make sure and basically anticipate people criticizing it, say, hey, these are the things which we saw whilst coming up with this as potential issues, but this is a reason why we think it's acceptable. And then alternatives are also wise, because there's always different ways to solve the same problem. So here you might talk about the fact that there are also shades of colors like red and purple, which sometimes also are appropriate. But we have, again, chosen red or blue because blue's best. And then security considerations is a big deal. And unstable prefixes I will talk about in excruciating detail in a few minutes. We are also thinking, or I at least want to add in a new section for dependent MSCs, just to make sure that if you've ended up with a whole pyramid of things that go into your grand proposal, like we have ended up with for spaces, for instance, you go and track what those MSCs actually are, so you can quickly skim and see, oh, well, I can't actually review this unless I've already reviewed the other ones, which it depends on. So that's the proposal template. Honestly, this is a good point before you go and put it into the repository, to go and run it past spec core team people, as I already mentioned. If you get positive feedback, then get PRing against the repository using that template. You've got the slight awkwardness that you don't know what number to call your MSC until you open the PR. So what I tend to do, and I think what most people tend to do, is to call it XXX. So I've got one here called the Room List API, which is probably never going to exist, but it was me experimenting with new sync APIs. And in fact, this is quite a good example in that this stuff at the bottom was taken straight out of a HackMD bunch of scribbles, and then at the top I've started to turn it into an actual proper MSC. So this is a real life in progress attempt at doing this MSC. And if I had finished it, I would go and save it. I would open up a PR. I would then rename, or I would name the file based on what I think the PR number is going to be by looking at what the highest number is right now and adding 1 to it. And then it gets its number like 1772. It's a bit clunky and irritating that you have to do the stupid dance, but at least it gives us consistent-ish numbers, which are easy to map through to GitHub IDs. If you haven't read the actual contribution guide before writing the MSC, you're probably doing it wrong. And I won't take you through it right now, but suffice it to say that it's a good document. And it's basically all this stuff at the top of the proposals page. If you are interested in submitting a change to the matrix spec, please read this. The guiding principles is really important, that these have to act to the greater benefit of all of matrix. So it should never be benefiting or privileging any single player or set of players over anybody else. Obviously, don't put patent encumbered intellectual property in here. And we as the spec core team are pledging to act as a neutral custodian of matrix for everybody. And we kind of define what greater benefit is and who the audience is. So this goes as much for people working at Element contributing to matrix as people working at any other company who are doing matrix work. The stuff they work on needs to be for the benefit of the whole community. Other stuff to call out is that it's really important to layer the stuff we do in matrix. Everything needs to build on top of existing abstractions. The internet only works because it's built much like an onion in layers, and you can swap out the different layers for different things without much coupling, if any, between them. And if we screw that up and we have proposals which violate the layers and go and introduce dependencies between them, the whole thing is going to very, very rapidly jam to a halt. So instead, this is in some ways our biggest defense against Mox's criticism that Matrix cannot evolve agilely or rapidly. Because it's decentralized. Instead, I say that if we've got solid foundations, we can rapidly swap out new stuff on top, as long as we ruthlessly layer those abstractions and avoid them having cross dependencies. Other stuff in here is spelling out the process, which is what I'm telling you now, but in slide form. And then there is a horrible ASCII diagram showing the same flow that I'm talking through, description of the lifetimes of the MSCs, and then the various different types of MSCs somewhere at the end. So I think a lot of people see this and think, oh my God, that was like 6 pages of reading and that looks scary. But honestly, it's pretty legible, particularly on the new template of the website, and I recommend reading through it properly before you actually do it. However, going back to the Bluffer's Guide, use the template. We've done that to death. And then the great thing about this is just go wild. Hack on your favorite client or server, see whether it works. Just be as crazy as possible. Like right now, we're experimenting with Sync v3 on Dendrite and Hydrogen, sort of trying to figure out what more efficient sync would look like that behaves a bit more like Discord. Let's just do it. It's a lot more fun to hack on a sort of experimental code base without any users than it is messing around with a more established thing where you've got to be careful not to break it for people. And again, before you spend too much time hacking on it, it might be worth checking that the spec core team thinks this is a good idea and it's not just going to get rejected because it already exists or something. But, and this is the one where we sometimes get a little bit stuck, you have to namespace these API changes with a prefix whilst you're experimenting in the implementation to avoid colliding with other people experimenting or yourself in the final spec. This is very, very common and expected that the MSC will evolve as people review it and as you hack on it. And the last thing you want is to have sort of versioning incompatibility namespace clashes between one variant of your own experiment and another variant of your own experiment. So prefixes. Go wild as long as it's under your own prefix. So you can't just go and start adding random endpoints without a prefix or fields to events, because obviously they would just leak into the public matrix network and they would basically become de facto spec without anybody having reviewed them and without them actually necessarily working. And nobody else will be able to implement them because they wouldn't be sufficiently specified and they're going to clash with other people. So please, obviously, don't just go and freestyle random new stuff into matrix. Instead, just go and chuck a prefix on it. So, for instance, if you were adding a new endpoint, what we do is to take the base of the API, like underscore matrix / client, and rather than it being R1 or whatever the sort of stable release prefix is, we use the unstable prefix, which is the word unstable, and then we have whatever namespace you are playing in. And you're very welcome to use org.matrix.msc, whatever the number is, or you could use a personal one. Like I'm arisphere.net, so it could be net.arisphere.threading if I'm playing around and I don't even have an MSC number yet. And then you obviously have the actual API name, whether it's Frobnicate or Logout or MRI or whatever it might happen to be. Endpoint changes are the easiest ones because they are completely transient and we can change the prefix in future relatively easily. Field names in events and other data is more tricky because obviously events are immutable in matrix. So whilst you are playing with a new feature like frobnication, whatever frobnication is, sounds a bit rude, you will go and prefix it with the namespace to stop it clashing with anybody else trying to implement frobnication today. And you will spam out a whole bunch of events which involve frobnication, and you will need to probably resign yourself to the fate that those events will in future no longer work once the feature stabilizes and the prefix goes away. Much like yeah, I mean, it's basically the price you pay. And I'll talk a bit about how you handle the unprefixing in a bit. But it's worth noting that this is kind of the worst case for prefixes. Although possibly the absolute worst case is room versions. So room versions are the thing which describe the version of the protocol that you use when you federate rooms together. So specifically, you only need to change it if you are changing the rules by which rooms basically replicate across matrix. And any even slight change to that sort of core mechanism for access control or the sort of contents of a room or what the IDs look like, etc., requires a different room version. And whilst we specify ones, which are numbers, I think we're on number 7 now. If you're experimenting with new one, again, you go and prefix it, but that room will only last for as long as that prefix is valid, because prefixes have limited lifetime. So you are only allowed to use these prefixes during development and then for 2 months after the spec has been released. And the reason we put this limit on it is that otherwise it's way too easy for the prefixes to become a de facto part of the protocol, because people never bother unprefixing, they never fix their clients or their servers. There's lots of events out there using the old prefixes, and before you know it, you end up with these weird, ugly, horrible custom prefixes flying around the place, which may or may not actually relate to stuff in the spec itself. So what we say is that once you've done experimenting and you want the feature to properly ship, obviously you want to get the MSC merged into the spec and then you unprefix it. So either you have to discard the data that you've accumulated, or you need to provide some kind of migration path. So if it's a room version change, then you would need to do a room version upgrade from org.matrix.msc1234.propagate through to version 8 room, or whatever the version of the room is that incorporates those changes. Or if it's a state event, you would need a client to run around looking for the old state events and upload them again, but this time without the prefix. And if it's a timeline event, as I said, you'd probably give up on it, although technically I guess you might be able to edit the event or send an edit to get rid of the old prefixes if you must. One other final thing here is if you do have a series of dependent MSCs, it's easy to get hung up on, oh my God, what order should we unprefix things and merge them in? And in practice, it doesn't matter that much. More of the issue is the just dependencies full stop between the MSCs, because it doesn't make sense to go and try to merge something into the spec that refers to MSCs which have not yet been merged into the spec. So just to dig a bit deeper onto the idea of shipping with prefixes, this is really quite unusual, I think, that you are completely allowed to ship software onto the public matrix network which has real users using it, not even behind labs flags or labeled beta, using experimental prefixes. It's how we can iterate rapidly and evolve rapidly and do sort of rapid product development on our respective clients and servers and try to compete with the big centralized players of the world, and just come up with crazy ideas, chuck them out there under a prefix. However, the later you leave it to incorporate your amazing feature into the spec, the more debt that you accumulate, because the more prefix data out there, the more you will need to migrate once it finally lands in the spec. So you're basically trading off the ability to ship faster by instead creating some debt that you have to pay off down the line when you do the migration needed to unprefix that data. So in general, if you can, it's better to just remove the prefix before you ship the spec. Before you ship the implementation into the wild, before you have too many people using it, so that you don't then have a painful migration where everybody has to recreate all their rooms using a different version or something. But if you're in a big rush for whatever reason, you can just punt that down the road if you really want to. Also, sometimes it really will be impossible to do a migration, like the editing millions of events that I mentioned earlier, at which point you just really have to unprefix before you ship. Otherwise, you're just going to clutter up the whole network with prefix things. And finally, sometimes you might not need to migrate at all, because if it's just an endpoint where you're switching from using the prefix version to the unprefixed stable one, you just go and do it. Finally, how do you get your MSC merged? So first of all, do you really need to get it merged? And it's a recurring theme that people might come to the spec core team to say, look, I really need to get this MSC merged. And because you can ship without it being merged or formalized, often it's an unnecessary dependency. It's an unnecessary blocker. Unless you really, really are at the point that you're about to go and push it out to the whole network for everybody to use, and you don't want to have migration hell down the road. So a good example is if you don't have an implementation showing this thing working, then you certainly don't need to merge the MSC into the spec, because we won't even let you until we've seen that it works. Then once you are actually at the final point of exiting beta and shipping it to the whole network, you need to make sure that everybody else obviously can implement it and use it too. Obviously, you will have got lots of informal review already by this point, whilst the PR was being drafted, either by spontaneous nosy people reading the repository on GitHub and asking for, or you might have asked for the review on the PR itself, or you might have formally requested the attention of the spec core team, or you might have just asked for opinion in #matrix-spec. Once you do want to get it merged, just mark the PR as ready for review, comment on the PR, ping us if you like. Please don't leave it marked work in progress or as a draft PR, because that, to the spec core team at least, means that it's work in progress or a draft PR and it is not yet ready for review or to be merged. Then the spec core team reviews it. There is an edge case called shepherding, where if the author is not available for some reason, then the spec core team might basically assign somebody else as an author, typically from the team, but it might be somebody else to basically help own the thing and get it through review. Review is just like any other code review. It's people commenting on it saying, are you sure this is the right way to do this? It can get a bit intense due to the size of the community and the fact that spec by definition can be quite a subjective thing, as people have strong ideas of how precisely they would build it. We try to moderate discussions particularly explicitly these days. It used to be a kind of free-for-all, but more recently we're treating it more as a sort of classic moderation problem to make sure that discussion is civil and constructive. But once the review process has happened, somebody on the spec core team says, right, this looks good, let's get it in the spec, and they do this magic @MSC bot FTP merge operation, which talks to Anoa's MSC bot, says we have a final call, or we're basically proposing a final call for comments to merge this. And it starts a counter for 5 days, which gives the community a final window to raise concerns. And every week, if you read This Week in Matrix, there is the spec section, which lists all of the MSCs which are in FCP, so that hopefully somebody in the community reading it says, oh, is Spaces in their FCP? Or has somebody proposed that Spaces enters FCP? How exciting. And they'll take a final look in it, and hopefully they will say, wow, what a well-written MSC that covers all of our use cases and doesn't have any horrible logic flaws. And wow, Matrix is evolving, this is so exciting. Or in a catastrophic situation, they might look at it and think, what? They've totally missed some horrible thing, and they'll raise a concern, and it will cancel the FCP, and we go back to re-review it to try to figure out how we missed the obvious thing that got raised. It's very rare that this happens. I think I've seen FCP being cancelled due to concerns being raised about twice, possibly 3 times in the whole thing, and we've gone through hundreds of these things now. Finally, once FCP is over, assuming that the proposition was to merge it rather than close it, because you can also FCP to say, hey, look, sorry, everybody, we don't think this is going to happen. Then if it's merged, we just merge the PR. And congratulations, as the developer at that point, you can unprefix your APIs, you can start using the final things as if they were in the final spec, and you can ship. And if you haven't unprefixed within 2 months of us finally getting around to cutting the next spec release, you'll start getting chased by us or the spec core team saying, "Oi, why are you still chucking out events with the prefix?" Or "Why does your client talk to random unstable APIs when we've now gone and incorporated this into the spec itself?" So to recap in graphical form, here is our 5-step plan for MSC lifecycle. Fork the matrix.repository, copy the template, write the MSC, create the PR, base the name of the PR of the MSC on the PR number, mark it as WIP or draft until you want to actually get somebody to review it. Once it's ready for review, we'll review it. Once the feedback's incorporated and any raised concerns are resolved, we start the FCP with intent to merge. Sits there for 5 days. If anybody raises concerns, it stops and we go back a step. Otherwise, the FCP completes. The PR is tagged as spec PR missing until that spec PR is written, typically by Travis, to incorporate the MSC into the actual spec. And then finally, that spec PR just gets reviewed by the spec call team like any other code review, merged, turns up, visible, deployed by the CI on spec.matrix.org/unstable. Can be used unprefixed on the wider network, although honestly it can be used unprefixed on the wider network after the FCP merge is complete. And then you, the developer, have 2 months to flush any unstable prefixes out of your implementations, and then the cycle of life is complete, or at least continues for the next MSC. So, worked example with spaces. Originally, I wrote the Spaces MSC ages ago in Google Docs before we started using Markdown and GitHub for MSCs. It then got converted to Markdown and PR'd as MSC1772. Now, I screwed up on this because Spaces turns out to be quite a large problem space, if you see what I did there. And we should have written a dedicated design doc, which then was split into the respective MSCs. But instead, I just brain dump basically everything about how I thought it should work into MSC1772, which meant that subsequently, and quite correctly, we've ended up factoring out the kind of different bits of it into other MSCs. And the other sort of 2 main MSCs, the 2962 and 3083, which handle different access control sort of aspects, aside from the core question of how do you define what a space is in Matrix. And the reason to do this is to avoid basically avoid review and problems with unrelated things holding up other bits of the MSC. So if you can split it up into kind of not smallest possible indivisible parts, but at least bite-sized chunks so that the uncontroversial bits can get through and be used usefully whilst people are still arguing about how the other bit should work, then you should do it, and you should do it early. And it's one of these obvious things in retrospect, but for ages we didn't do it. And I couldn't work out why GitHub was crashing, and there'd be 600 comments on this massive MSC, and it all feels very overwhelming, and you never want to look at it again. I'm not looking at you aggregation specifically. And then somebody would say, well, hang on a sec, these are all completely different things in here. Why don't we split it into like 5 different MSCs? And then it gets a lot better. So looking specifically at MSC 1772, there are 4 prefixes involved. There is a type, which is a property that is proposed for mroom create that gives you the concept of immutable types on matrix rooms. Then you've got a value for that type field called m.space. And then you have 2 event types, m.space.child and m.space.parent, that goes and describes the actual hierarchy with a double-linked tree that creates your space hierarchy these days in Matrix. And then we have our prefixes. And so this table is literally taken straight out of the MSC, that you have the proposed identifier as it will appear in the final spec, what it's used for, and then the prefixed identifier that you use when you're hacking on it and developing it. And so right now, if you were to create a space in Element on web or Android, it would use these prefixes of org.matrix or MSC1772, both to identify the type of the room as a space and then to describe the children and the parents of said space. So we could ship with these prefixes, but we would then have to provide a migration path. And as these room types are immutable, this would be pretty disruptive, because having gone and created all of your spaces whilst playing with spaces, the second that it ships, there would be some version of element pushed out there which would say, oh crap, we shouldn't be using the prefix version anymore, we should be using the final version, and therefore I'm going to have to recreate all of these rooms using the unprefixed type name at the beginning and the unprefixed date events. Now, as it happens, we will need to recreate these rooms anyway when MSC 3083 lands, because it bumps the room version, and so we're going to need to upgrade our space rooms to use the new room version. But that disruption, that's actually only needed for private rooms, and so we can avoid it for public rooms. We also do need to make sure that we can do room upgrades, of course, but basically we saw that we could avoid having to do a compulsory upgrade rapidly of public rooms, and so have decided to ship without prefixes. And this was actually decided last night. Originally, there was an experiment to see if we could just split out the type definition into a separate MSC 3137 to unprefix it to ship sooner. But that fell apart because just splitting out an identifier into its own MSC doesn't really work, because what is it identifying? It's all very well saying that m.space is a thing, but if you don't say what that actually means and other people implement different things which refer to m.space, it's just going to be a mess. So instead, we just said we're going to take the base MSC and we're going to get it through review, get it through FCP, and then it can ship in element across the board as an unprefixed final version, and nobody will have to create any rooms in order to flesh out the prefixed versions until at least the next room version bump. So that's it, I think, for the spaces example. Final quick tips. This wasn't meant to be a substitution for reading the full guide on the proposals page. Please go and read it if you're writing MSCs. Again, get review early as possible. So many people spend ages crafting their beautiful edifice only to discover that it's a duplicate or otherwise completely ill-founded. Really important one. People often see MSCs and think, oh my God, this is formal and bureaucratic and complicated, and I must behave as if I'm writing the French Constitution or the American Constitution and get out my quill and say, no, my vision for this amazing feature, which will change the world forever, and heretofore, after, by, within, therein, and all these other words. Just keep it simple and stupid. And I know that I waffle a lot, but I think even I can keep it relatively coherent and high signal to noise in an MSC, because there's nothing worse reading through paragraphs of waffle to try to understand what problem is actually trying to be solved and what the solution is. Remember that we're in an open internet, and this is an open governance process, and anybody is very welcome to both submit MSCs and comment and review on them. And sometimes the wider comments may or may not be well balanced. If you think that somebody is not being constructive, come and talk to the spec core team. And these days we will intercede and DM them and say, oi, please, can you stop arguing with every single thing that comes up on this MSC, because it's not helping us get to a conclusion on it. Another plug for HackMD or Hedgehog, which is awesome for collaboratively sketching these things out. Try to keep them small, refactor if it's getting too big, as I said earlier. And finally, please remember to layer your features in Matrix, because otherwise the entire protocol and planet will grind to a halt. And I think that's it. Oh no, who are we? So you got me, nominally lead and also guardian, which means I'm a director of the Matrix.org Foundation. And at the moment, my input is mainly spent doing things like this, like meta stuff. You got Eric looking after server-related MSCs. You got Rich looking after servers and cryptography stuff. You got Dave looking after stuff from the client side, but also the IS API to some extent, the push API, the VoIP stuff, media stuff. You got Hubert, particularly focusing on cryptography and everything. You got Andrew or Noah looking after servers, AS API, and spec process stuff like the MSC bot. You got Travis doing spec PRs. bots, bridges, AS APIs, media, and all sorts of other stuff. And finally, we have Alexi, sometimes known as Kitsune, who's looking particularly at clients on behalf of the community, but also the Matrix URI scheme. And thank you, folks, for having put up with working on the spec core team and trying to make Matrix a better place over the last, I think, getting on for 3 years now, which is a bit petrifying, but that's how long that we've been at this, trying to nudge Matrix further along. And that really is the end. So, sorry for monologuing. Any questions from anybody?
Yeah, Matthew, it's Valère. I'm not sure the quality of my mic. Tell me if it's okay.
It is exquisite.
Okay. So yeah, it was related to the space MSC. We are supposed to build in layer. So shouldn't we make MSC for immutable room type so that we can, without, reserving the m dot space?
So the granularity of the layering isn't meant to reflect the MSCs, because remember that the MSCs are just patches against the spec. So it's a bit icky that we ended up with immutable types and spaces mixed together. But what would have been a lot ickier would have been, I don't know, if we went and put the immutable type idea inside a space-specific event, say, and we just defined type immutability in a way that only worked for spaces. That would have been a complete mess, because the next time that somebody else needs an immutable type, they would have created another type for their thing, and it would be somewhere else. And before you know it, you've got a fundamental contradiction that the room has got 2 different immutable types saying different things, at which point which one is true, blah, blah, blah. So it's certainly good hygiene to try to have MSCs do one thing and do it well, and refactor if they don't. And it's a bit of a bad smell that we incorporated the typing into it. And if you recall yesterday at the end of the spaces meeting for people working on the space proposal, I think with 30 seconds to spare said, actually guys, why don't we keep 3137 as just an immutable type thing? And because we only had 30 seconds left in the meeting and we really wanted to ship it, we just said, sod it, we'll leave it where it is. But yeah, it's sort of right that the MSCs should do one thing and one thing well, but it's not incompatible with good layering.
It's sometimes true. There is the joke that there is an MSC for that. It's true that when you want to do something, there is an MSC already doing it.
Well, I mean, if the MSC, yeah, I mean, that would be a great point to talk to the spec core team and say, hey, I want to build my widget and it has this dependency. I see there's an MSC already for this dependency. And in fact, types is a great one, because there is already an MSC for types, MSC 1840, written by John Fredrickson, who I think is at Linode in these days. And JFred said, hey, why don't we have an m.room.type thing, which gives you mutable room types? And then we found ourselves doing spaces, needing types. And so the question is, hey, do we build on that MSC? Or do we actually want immutable room types, in which case we need to have our own thing? And if you were making that choice, as effectively happened, you should be coming and chatting to the spec core team to say, look, should this be mutable or not? And should we be building on an existing MSC or not?
What is the most successful community-driven MSC?
Wow, that's a good question. Travis, are you out there? You surely know the answer to this. No, Travis? Very sad.
I think spoilers were a community MSC, right?
Yeah, spoilers were, except I'm not sure. Actually, I guess it is successful in that we have spoilers support in lots of different clients. I'm totally blanking. Anybody from the spec core team remind me of good examples of completely community contributed ones? Let me just go and look on the list. It'll come back to me.
The Matrix URL scheme?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends on whether you count Kitsune as community.
Yeah.
I mean, he's obviously part of the spec core team, but he doesn't work at Element. Let me see.
Knocking was started by Surinome.
Yep.
It got picked up by Anoa, but it was started by Surinome.
Yeah, and that's quite a major, surprisingly major change in some ways. And in fact, Soru has done a bunch of really good MSCs over the years. If I just go and look through for their name on the list, I'm wondering what other ones are out there. Yeah, things. Well, so what I can see potentially being really successful from Soru's side is the ability to have encrypted rooms where use some signatures for end-to-end encryption to sign stuff in unencrypted rooms. So to basically prove that people said the things they claim to say without actually going the whole hog and encrypting them, which we haven't hasn't actually gone all the way through the process yet, but it's quite a nice one. There's things like sending EDUs to app services, which is a perennial one. I'm not sure whether any of those are particularly successful because they always seem to get a bit stuck. Hubert, can you think of any other good ones? About a third of the MSCs come from the community, from memory. Well, one that I'd love to see is Talir's asynchronous media uploads, so the ability to download files whilst you're uploading them, which we used to have pre-Matrix and still hasn't made it into Matrix, but Talir proposed that as MSC 2246. But I think that one suffered from not just getting implemented, but if somebody liked it enough to have implemented it, then we would have gone and incorporated it in.
Yeah, so ideally you come with the MSC and some PRs on Synapse and clients. And this should accelerate the process.
Yeah, well, hopefully the people proposing them should typically go and, if they think their thing is good enough to write a MSC about it, hopefully they think it's good enough to also hack it into their client to share how cool it is, and that it would kind of accelerate from there. What other questions? Did this make any sense? Hi, no.
Hello, sorry to jump on you there. I've got a couple of small questions, I think. The first is, let's say I'm a client developer and I'm rapidly prototyping some experiments I expect to be short-lived. Is the expectation that there should always be a draft MSC, or is it fine just to ship things with unstable prefixes, and then as long as we're not littering and hitting that 2-month timeline, we're good? No,
it's absolutely fine. You don't need to even have a public spec for the thing. You can just pick a random prefix like net.arsphere.random experiment and play with it, and you can play with it on the public network too, and everybody will dutifully ignore it because it's some random prefix they know nothing about. And then if it starts to have legs, then you might want to formalize that as an MSC, get review on it, and it's only after the thing has been agreed, approved, merged into the spec and released that you finally is the latest point that you can unprefix. But in practice, it's probably going to be better to unprefix earlier. Otherwise, you're just littering the place with your weird experiments.
Okay, that makes sense. And then in a similar vein, but on the MSC side, is there any expectation around the lifetime of draft MSCs? Like, do we clear them out after a certain amount of time to avoid rot, or do we let them hang around because actually it's great to let draft MSCs mature over time, or is it case by case?
Yeah, it's really case by case. I mean, looking at the very bottom of the list on the proposals page, you've got the obsolete section, which is the abandoned section. And there's probably, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's about 20 abandoned ones and probably about 30 obsolete ones, where we've been reviewing it as a spec core team and consciously seen it and thought, actually, this one is no longer relevant. Like 3137, the definer space room type spit out from 1772 was abandoned because we realized it didn't actually make sense and that we should just ship 1772 instead. Meanwhile, all the others are there because they could be valid, and we look at the upvotes on them quite a lot to see what people are most excited about and what should be prioritized. And the spec core team every week has sort of designated blocks of time for actually forcing us to work through the backlog and push things forwards, as well as any kind of sort of elective time that we managed to find to work on it ourselves. And basically everything which is open has validity of some flavor and could be nudged forwards to actually finish off. And the fact that some of them drag on for years isn't necessarily a bad thing, but at least it's sort of giving a skeleton that can be fleshed out as time goes on, depending on what people need out of the protocol. 3 minutes left.
Thanks.
That's right. What other questions? Did this make sense? Was I talking too quick or anything?
Yeah, the prefix section was quite enlightening for me. Makes me want to feel like writing MSCs.
It's genuinely fun. As in, I wrote all of the 1772 style ones over Christmas to relax in 2018, and it was great. And I just thought, someday we will have spaces. I'm sure it will be in 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
Little did I know.
Talking about that, is element supposed to be the reference implementation? So meaning that if there is an MSC merge, we should implement it?
No, Element itself as an app is not a reference implementation. It's just an attempt to put a good app out into the ecosystem that helps bootstrap Matrix as an ecosystem. But the SDKs underneath Element, so Matrix React SDK, JS SDK, and iOS and Android SDK too, technically are reference implementations for their respective platforms. And so I guess ideally they should implement everything, but we've always been a little bit sloppy as to what reference means in that context. And whilst Synapse is nominally a reference, it also has its things it doesn't implement, or it's things which are left over from pre-spec times. So Element itself, though, isn't released by the Matrix.org Foundation. It's released by Element as a company to try to bootstrap the ecosystem.
How about use cases where you're developing an MSC-like feature that's only really useful for a certain community? For example, playing chess over Matrix, that certainly wouldn't be maintained in the Matrix core spec. So is it an option to keep it namespaced all of the time during its lifetime, or?
Yeah, I think so. You could even, I guess, put it in as an MSC, but without the intention of it ever necessarily being in the spec, and just use it more like a IETF RFC or something. That's a good point. I don't think anyone has ever asked that question before. Anybody else have an idea of a better answer to that? Hubert or anybody? No. Okay.
Extensible events also tie into this, I guess.
Well, that's true. Yeah. So, God, yes. I mean, actually, the answer is extensible events. Thank you, Bruno. That extensible events define how you can do wacky custom things which nobody understands and yet have them interoperable to some extent with other Matrix clients. So for a chess game, you could attach a thumbnail with your chess moves so that people who are on a client that doesn't understand chess moves could still actually show the little thumbnail of your chessboard, or perhaps the short form ASCII K4 dash whatever it is style notation.
And actually, something done only using extensible events, so meaning none that doesn't need any server change. Does it need to be as an MSC? I don't know, with like the breadcrumbs or any kind of room decorations.
No, I mean, client-side stuff is entirely up to the client to do in terms of UI. The spec is very specifically just saying how clients should interact with servers and how servers should interact with servers and so on.
Okay.
So, for instance, on breadcrumbs, if you wanted to specify a consistent way for a breadcrumb feature to operate across clients, because let's face it, it's kind of useful to have a list of the rooms you've most been recently in, then that could and probably should be part of the spec. And it starts off as an element specific thing, or whatever your client is, and you might store it in account data as im.vector.room.breadcrumbs or whatever the key is that you put it in your account data. But the second that you think this is something useful that other clients might also want to keep track of where the other clients have been looking, then chuck it in an MSC, and it would be a really quick one to put in there. In fact, has somebody done this? Is there an MSC for breadcrumbs? There isn't. Well volunteered, below.
Okay.
Honestly, it would be a really simple, obvious,
Yeah.
nice, quick one to do.
Nice one to do.
Yep.
And, that would be the same for spaces, I guess. I don't know. Pin
Yeah.
spaces and things like that. Custom order. I don't know.
Could discuss in a spec for breadcrumbs if we can make it more privacy preserving and hash the room IDs or something.
Yeah. Although, yeah, that's a good point. Although it's a little bit of a, I mean, that's a typical, slightly bike sheddy question that will come up, because superficially it sounds like a great idea, but then of course your server obviously knows what you're doing because it's the server who is handing you the data in the first place. But I guess then you're going to say, if it's a thick client, then it's possible that the client is watching different rooms and the server just doesn't know what it's looking at and might not be able to infer it. So perhaps we should hash it, blah, 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 that goes back and forth, and you probably win that one. And then somebody would have a massive argument over what hash to use.
Oh, we put it in the queries. It's a layer.
Yeah. Yeah, clearly end-to-end encryption, privacy preserving breadcrumbs is the way forward. Get all of our performance problems as the clients frantically encrypt your breadcrumbs every single time you change room. Any final questions? I appreciate that it's the end of the day and the week for almost everybody.
Is there a way to see MSCs that need implementations done?
That is an excellent point. I don't think that we have a tag on the repository for needs implementation. I might be wrong, but it would be an obvious thing to have. Yeah, no, good idea. Let's do it. Thanks, Sarah.
So we can have polls in other clients.
Any final stuff otherwise? Yeah, there isn't needs implementation. We shall add it in. Cool. In which case, thank you everybody for being an audience, for me trying to explain that MSCs are actually fun and kind of the best bit of Matrix when they don't go horribly wrong. And as we get older and more experienced, the scope for them going horribly wrong gets less and less. And also to reassure that Spaces, in some ways, is a bit of a perfect storm because we have new room versions and we have new event types and we've got new immutable prefixes and room creations and we've got a tree of dependencies, and it turns out to be surprisingly hard. And people seem to have very strong feelings about how ACL should work. But we got through it in the end because we proposed FCP on it yesterday. And I don't know how many checkboxes there are, but when it gets to 75%, it will start the 5-day countdown in order for any final concerns. Oh, it started 22 minutes ago, literally, in the middle of this talk. How cool is that? So yeah, 5 days from now, Spaces will be ready for action at the spec level. So let's hope that nobody in the next 5 days is actually going to review it and see some horrible gaping holes. But given we've had 3 years to review it, 3 years, it'd be pretty disappointing if they do. Okay, everybody, thanks for listening, and bye.
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 Bye-bye.